It was one of those evenings that people remembered for a long time. Not because of who was famous or who performed, but because of the quiet tension that filled the room. The auditorium was packed. Every seat was taken, and even the aisles were lined with people standing, leaning forward, waiting for something special to happen. The event was the final round of a national music competition. For weeks, hundreds of contestants had been filtered out until only a handful remained. Everyone knew what the final challenge was. A piano piece so difficult that even experienced musicians called it impossible to play perfectly. It wasn't just fast or long. It was full of tricky transitions, shifting rhythms, and moments where both hands had to move in completely different directions. Many had tried and most had failed. The audience had already sat through hours of performances. Some had been beautiful, others shaky, but none had been perfect. By the time the last few performers came up, even the judges, 5 experts known for their high standards, were looking tired. One of them kept rubbing his eyes. Another was quietly flipping through his notes, as if looking for something redeeming to score higher. When the next contestant walked up, the crowd clapped politely. The performer bowed, sat down, and started to play. The first few notes were confident, but soon the rhythm wavered. A small mistake led to another and another. By the end of the piece, the sound was more noise than music. The contestant left the stage quickly, head down, avoiding the eyes of the judges. The judges exchanged glances, silent but clear in their thoughts. One sighed deeply. Another leaned back in the chair and whispered something that made the others nod. It was the same thing everyone was thinking. Maybe nobody could play this piece the way it was meant to be played. The next performer tried harder, but the story repeated itself. At one point, the pianist stopped completely, hands frozen above the keys, unable to continue. The audience clapped softly, trying to encourage, but everyone could feel the same weight in the air. Disappointment. By now, the night had grown late. Some people were already checking their phones, a few even getting up to leave quietly. The excitement that had filled the room at the beginning was slowly fading into restlessness. It was as if the entire hall had accepted that this challenge was simply too much for anyone to overcome. One of the judges leaned toward the microphone and spoke softly to the host sitting nearby. "Maybe we should wrap this up soon," he said. "It's been a long day." The host nodded, understanding. They were all ready to call it a night. But before they could officially close the round, a soft voice came from the side of the stage. "Excuse me, there's one more participant." The room went quiet for a moment. Everyone turned their heads. From behind the curtain, a small figure stepped forward. A child, barely tall enough to reach the microphone stand. He held his contestant card nervously in his hand. His shoes made tiny tapping sounds on the wooden floor as he walked toward the piano. There was a short pause, followed by a few quiet chuckles from the crowd. Some thought it was cute. Others thought it was a joke. A few even whispered, "He's too young. This is impossible." The judges exchanged looks again. One of them smiled kindly, though his eyes showed doubt. "Young man," he said gently, "are you sure you're ready to play this piece?" The boy nodded without hesitation. His voice was small but firm. "Yes, sir." For a moment no one spoke. The host gave a little shrug, as if to say, "Why not? Let him try." And so the judges agreed. The boy climbed onto the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, his feet barely touching the pedals. The hall fell into a curious silence. The child placed his small hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes for a moment. His face was calm. Not proud or scared, just calm, as if he had been here before in some quiet dream. The first note hadn't even been played yet, but somehow, the air in the room changed. People leaned forward again, whispering softly, wondering what would happen. One of the judges leaned back in his chair, half smiling, half skeptical. He whispered to the others, "Let's give him a moment. It's good for his confidence." The others nodded. They weren't expecting much. But even as they waited, something about the boy's stillness drew their attention. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't glancing around the audience or looking at the judges for approval. He just sat there, focused, hands resting on the keys like he already knew exactly what he was going to do. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky. Inside, you could hear nothing but the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet breaths of hundreds of people waiting. For the audience, it was a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Could a child really handle something that trained adults couldn't? Could he even reach all the keys? Some people smiled in encouragement. Others prepared themselves for another awkward attempt. But the boy didn't seem to notice any of it. To him, it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about competition or applause. It was about the music itself, the melody he had heard so many times in his head that it had become part of him. The judges, who had nearly surrendered their patience, didn't realize that the night was about to change. Before the first note, one of them muttered under his breath, "This is probably the last performance of the night. Let's make it quick." Another nodded, closing his notebook as if ready to end the day. But the audience wasn't ready to look away. There was something almost magnetic about that small figure on the stage, sitting in front of that grand piano, surrounded by silence. His fingers moved slightly, as if testing the air. His shoulders relaxed. And though he was only 8, his expression carried a calmness that didn't belong to a child. The room was still heavy with the disappointment of all the failed attempts before him. Yet in that single quiet moment, something began to shift. It wasn't hope, not yet, but curiosity. A woman sitting in the front row felt her heart skip a beat. She turned to her friend and whispered, "There's something about this boy." Her friend smiled. "He's brave, that's for sure." Up on the judge's table, a pen rolled off and clattered softly on the floor. No one bent to pick it up. Their eyes were still fixed on the boy, who hadn't even started to play. The host stood at the edge of the stage, holding the microphone loosely, uncertain of what to say next. It was as if everyone in that single instant had decided to wait, to give the child his moment. The camera operators leaned in, zooming their lenses closer. The boy's small hands looked fragile against the wide black and white keys, but they rested there with quiet confidence. One deep breath. That's all it took. The boy lifted his head slightly, opened his eyes, and pressed the first key. The sound was pure and soft, a single note that filled the entire hall, carried more emotion than anyone expected. In that instant, something invisible but powerful passed through the crowd, the sound of disbelief melting into silence. Even the judges, who had just moments ago given up, froze in their seats. It was only one note, but somehow it promised everything that was about to come. The night that had felt heavy and hopeless suddenly felt alive again. No one knew yet what this child was capable of, but every person in the room could feel it. Something was about to happen that they wouldn't forget. The boy's first note lingered in the air, pure and steady, as if time had slowed down. Every sound that came after seemed to follow a rhythm only he could hear. His small hands began to move gently at first, then with growing confidence. The notes flowed like water, smooth and natural, filling every corner of the hall. People who had been leaning back in their seats now sat up straight. The judges, who had nearly closed their notebooks, were suddenly alert. No one expected this. Not from a child, not at this hour, not after so many had failed. The music was supposed to be too hard. It was a piece that even older students at conservatories struggled with. It had tricky parts, fast jumps, and sections where both hands had to play completely opposite rhythms. But somehow, this boy played it like it was breathing through him. His eyes weren't on the keys. They were closed most of the time, his head tilting slightly with the rhythm, his expression calm and focused. Every movement of his fingers felt like part of a story only he knew how to tell. In the audience, there were people who had stopped recording on their phones earlier in the evening, thinking the competition was already over. Now they lifted their devices again, pressing record, afraid to miss what was happening. Even the air felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. The boy's small frame looked almost fragile under the stage lights, but his music had power, carried emotion far bigger than his age. One of the judges, a man who had been teaching piano for more than 30 years, leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes wide. He mouthed a single word to another judge sitting beside him. Impossible. The other judge didn't respond. She was too busy listening, her pen frozen above her paper. What they were hearing didn't make sense. There was no hesitation, no stumble, no awkward pause. Every note landed exactly where it should. The boy reached a section in the piece that had made every previous performer fall apart. A difficult run of chords that changed tempo in an unpredictable pattern. It was a part that required not just skill but instinct. And somehow he did it effortlessly. His fingers moved so fast that they blurred under the lights, yet every sound was clear. The notes came like rain, soft, even, but unstoppable. The rhythm built up until the sound filled the room with a strange kind of energy, something you could almost feel in your chest. The judges exchanged glances again, but this time, it wasn't disappointment. It was disbelief. In the front row, a woman clasped her hands together tightly. She wasn't his mother, but she felt tears forming in her eyes. There was something pure about the way he played, something honest. It wasn't about showing off or winning. It was about feeling the music completely. When the piece reached its soft middle section, the boy slowed down. His hands relaxed, his shoulders eased, and a gentle melody floated through the room. People who had been holding their breath finally exhaled. Some smiled quietly to themselves. Others leaned back, lost in the sound. For a moment, it felt like the hall had turned into another world. The lights were warm and dim, the air calm. The only thing that mattered was the story being told through the piano. The boy's small face showed deep concentration. His lips moved slightly, not singing but breathing with the rhythm. Every note seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. As if he wasn't playing the music, he was remembering it. One of the camera operators zoomed in closer. The boy's fingers looked too small for the wide keys, yet they moved with perfect control. His wrist stayed relaxed. His posture never broke. His body flowed with the music in a way that felt both natural and magical. The judges didn't write anything down. There was nothing to write. They just listened. When the piece reached its final section, the energy began to rise again. The notes became faster, more intense, but still flawless. His hands moved across the keys with a confidence that seemed beyond his years. It wasn't practiced perfection, it was real connection. Somewhere in the middle rows, a young music student whispered to her friend, "He's not reading sheet music." Her friend frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's playing from memory," she said softly. "Or maybe not even memory. He just knows it." The realization spread quietly through the audience. The boy hadn't brought any music sheets with him. He wasn't looking at anything. He was playing a piece considered nearly impossible by heart. The judges' eyes widened further. For them, this wasn't just talent. This was something rare, a natural genius, the kind that comes once in a lifetime. The final moments of the piece approached, and the melody began to climb higher. The boy leaned slightly forward, his hands gliding across the piano in a blur of motion. The sound built like a wave, powerful, emotional, unstoppable. And then, just as suddenly, it softened. He finished with a single note, soft and perfect, that faded slowly into silence. No one moved, not even the boy. His hands stayed on the keys for a moment, his head bowed slightly. Then he exhaled, quietly, like someone waking up from a dream. The hall was still. For a few seconds, you could hear nothing but the faint hum of the lights. And then one person clapped just once. It echoed through the hall like a spark. Another clap followed. Then another. And then the entire audience erupted. The sound was thunderous. Applause, cheers, people standing up from their seats. Some were shouting, others whistling. The boy blinked in surprise, his small body frozen in place. He looked confused, as if he didn't understand what was happening. The judges stood too. All 5 of them. It wasn't a planned gesture. They hadn't discussed it or agreed beforehand. They just did it instinctively. They stood and applauded the child who had done what no one else could do that night. Even the host, who had been watching from the side of the stage, had tears in his eyes. He raised the microphone but couldn't speak for a moment. He finally managed to say, "Ladies and gentlemen, You have just witnessed something truly extraordinary. The boy stood and bowed shyly. His hands trembled a little. When he lifted his head, he gave a small smile, the kind of smile that made your heart feel warm. It wasn't pride. It was innocence. He turned to walk off the stage, but the crowd kept clapping, louder and louder. The sound followed him as he disappeared behind the curtain. Back at the judges' table, one of them shook his head slowly, still clapping. "I've never seen anything like that," he said softly. "Never." Another nodded, her eyes shining. "He didn't just play the notes," she whispered. "He spoke through them." Behind the curtain, the boy's parents stood waiting. His mother's eyes were filled with tears she tried to hide. His father knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. The boy looked up at him, puzzled. "Did what?" His father smiled through his tears. "You reminded everyone what real music feels like." The boy thought for a moment, then said softly, "I just played what I hear in my head." Out in the hall, people were still clapping. Some were wiping their eyes, others laughing in disbelief. The judges, who had almost ended the competition early, now stood humbled, their faces showing both joy and shock. No one could explain how it happened. There was no trick, no help, no rehearsal with expensive teachers. Just a child, a piano, and a song that seemed to come straight from his heart. That night, the story of the performance began to spread. People shared the video online, calling him the little genius and the boy who made the judges surrender. But at that moment, behind the curtain, he wasn't thinking about fame or titles. He was just happy. Happy that the sound in his head had finally reached other hearts. And though he didn't know it yet, that one performance would soon travel far beyond that hall, touching people around the world. People who needed to believe that sometimes, miracles really do happen through the simplest hands. Backstage was quieter than the hall, but the sound of applause still echoed faintly through the walls. The boy sat on a small chair, his feet not quite reaching the floor, staring at his hands. They were still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the strange feeling of what had just happened. He could still hear the melody in his mind, the notes replaying softly as if the piano were still in front of him. For a moment, he just sat there in silence, listening to his own heartbeat. It was steady, calm, like the rhythm of the music he had just played. His parents were nearby, speaking quietly with one of the event organizers. They looked both proud and confused. Proud because their son had done something extraordinary, and confused because they couldn't understand how he did it. The organizer kept shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, still holding his clipboard. The judges were speechless. "They want to speak with him before the final announcement." The boy's father nodded. "Of course," he said softly. He turned to his son and crouched down. "Did you know they're calling you a genius out there?" The boy blinked. "What's that mean?" His father smiled. "It means you did something very special." The boy tilted his head. "I just played the song." His father chuckled quietly. "Yes," he said, "but you played it in a way no one else could." Before he could say more, one of the judges entered the backstage area. He was an older man, his face still showing the mix of shock and admiration he had worn in the hall. When he saw the boy, he smiled warmly. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked gently. The boy nodded. The judge sat down beside him, resting his hands on his knees. "Do you know that piece you just played?" he began. "It's considered one of the hardest compositions in the world. Even professionals struggle with it. How long have you been practicing it?" The boy thought for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just listened to it a lot." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Listened? You mean by ear?" The boy nodded again. "I heard it on the computer. I liked how it sounded, so I tried to play it." The judge's eyes widened. He looked at the boy's parents, then back at the child. "You learned it just by listening?" The boy shrugged, as if it wasn't a big deal. "It took me a while. The middle part was tricky, but it sounded wrong if I didn't play it right. So I kept fixing it until it felt right." The judge leaned back in his chair, speechless for a moment. He had spent decades teaching students who practiced for years to achieve what this child had done naturally. And this boy had simply listened. He smiled again, softer this time. "You have a gift," he said. "Something rare." The boy looked at him curiously. "What kind of gift?" The judge chuckled. "The kind you don't find in textbooks," he said. "You play from here." He pointed gently to his chest. "Not just your hands." The boy didn't say anything. He just smiled a little, unsure how to respond. Out in the hall, people were still talking about him. The audience hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd left the stage. Some were replaying the video clips they had recorded on their phones, showing them to anyone who would look. "Listen to this part," one woman said to her friend, holding her phone up. "He's only 8. Look how calm he is." Another man nearby shook his head. "I've seen professionals mess that section up 100 times. How did he do it?" No one had an answer. It didn't matter whether they were musicians or not. Everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The judges took a while to return to their table. When they finally did, they looked different. Less like critics, more like people who had just remembered why they loved music in the first place. One of them wiped his eyes quietly before picking up her microphone. When the time came to announce the results, the audience quieted immediately. The host's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling, "I think tonight, we all witnessed something we'll remember for the rest of our lives." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. He continued, "The judges have made their decision. But before we reveal it, they would like to say something." One of the judges stood and walked toward the front of the stage. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "In all my years of judging competitions," he began, "I have never been so deeply moved by a performance. What we saw tonight wasn't just skill. It was heart, honesty, and pure love for music." The audience applauded again. He smiled slightly. "There's a saying that talent can be taught, but passion cannot. Tonight we saw both. And from someone we least expected." He paused, letting the moment sink in. "Our highest score, and the winner of this year's national competition, goes to our youngest contestant." The crowd erupted. People stood, clapping and cheering, as the boy was led back onto the stage. The lights shone brighter now, casting a soft glow around him. He looked a little lost at first, eyes wide as he gazed at the sea of faces cheering for him. The host handed him a small golden trophy. It gleamed in his hands, almost too big for him to hold comfortably. "How do you feel?" the host asked, lowering the microphone toward him. The boy looked at the audience, then back at the host. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the speakers. "I just wanted to play it right," he said. The crowd laughed softly, touched by the innocence in his answer. After the ceremony, people lined up to congratulate him. Some wanted photos, others simply wanted to shake his hand. The boy smiled politely but looked a little overwhelmed by all the attention. His parents stayed close, thanking everyone who approached. They had never imagined this kind of night. Not like this. They had entered him into the competition because he loved playing, not because they expected him to win. When they finally stepped outside, the cool night air hit their faces. The noise of the crowd faded behind them. The boy looked up at the sky, the stars faint but visible. He took a deep breath, letting the silence settle. His mother looked down at him. "You did so well," she said softly. He smiled. "It felt like the song was playing by itself," he said. "I just followed it." His father laughed quietly. "Well, whatever it was, the whole world's going to know about it soon." He wasn't wrong. By the next morning, videos of his performance had spread across social media. People shared it everywhere. Music pages, news sites, even television networks picked it up. Comments poured in from around the world. "This is unbelievable," one person wrote. "Pure talent." Another said, "I've watched this 10 times. I can't believe he's only 8. Musicians started analyzing his technique online. Some tried to explain it. Maybe he had perfect pitch, maybe he had trained in secret, but none of them could fully capture what made it special. The video reached millions of views within a few days. Interview requests started coming in. Reporters called the competition organizers, wanting to meet the boy. But while the internet buzzed with excitement, the boy himself didn't seem to care much about the fame. He still spent most of his time doing what he always did, sitting at the piano, playing quietly to himself. When someone asked him later what it felt like to be famous, he simply said, "It feels the same. I still just like the music." His answer melted hearts everywhere. People admired not just his gift, but his simplicity. He wasn't trying to be a star. He was just being himself, a child who loved sound and rhythm. As weeks went by, invitations came from music schools, concerts, even television shows. Some people wanted to teach him, others wanted to perform with him. But the boy never seemed interested in showing off. He preferred the quiet moments, sitting at the piano when no one was watching. And though many people spoke about him, about his talent, his age, his unbelievable performance, very few realized the truth. For him, it was never about being the best. It was never about proving anything. It was about the feeling he got when his fingers touched the keys, the way the notes made everything else disappear, and how, for just a few moments, the world felt perfectly still. That was what he loved most. And that simple truth was what had made the entire hall, the judges, and thousands of people watching online believe again, that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the simplest hearts. The weeks that followed the competition felt like a dream, not just for the boy, but for everyone who had been there that night. The performance had become more than a memory. It had become a story people loved to tell. Everyone had their own version of it. Some said they cried when they heard him play. Others said they had never seen judges so moved in their lives. The video of his performance spread across the internet faster than anyone expected. News channels played it during their morning shows. Music teachers used it in classrooms to inspire their students. People who didn't even understand classical music said it made them feel something they couldn't explain. The boy's parents watched all of it with quiet disbelief. Their small home, once filled only with the sound of piano keys and laughter, was now filled with calls, messages, and letters from around the world. Some people wanted interviews. Some wanted to offer scholarships. Others simply wanted to say thank you for bringing hope into their lives. The boy didn't fully understand what was happening. He knew people were happy because of his music, but he didn't understand why it was such a big deal. To him, it was just what he loved doing. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just liked how music felt, the way it could tell a story without using words. Every morning after breakfast, he would go to the piano and play quietly for a while. He didn't care about being on television or meeting reporters. He cared about the sound. His mother would often peek in from the kitchen and smile. There was something peaceful about watching him play. It was like the rest of the world disappeared for him when his fingers touched the keys. One afternoon, the family received a call from the competition organizers. They said an international music school wanted to meet the boy. They had seen the video and were offering to train him with top instructors. The boy's parents were stunned. It was the kind of opportunity that could change a life forever. That night, they sat together in the living room, talking softly. His father said, "This could open so many doors for you. You'd learn from the best." His mother added gently, "But only if you want to. You don't have to say yes." The boy listened quietly. After a long pause, he said, "Will I still be able to play the songs I like?" His parents looked at each other and smiled. "Of course," his father said. "You can always play what you love." The boy nodded. "Then I'll go." A few weeks later, the family traveled to the city where the school was located. It was much larger than the boy expected. Tall buildings, crowded streets, and people rushing everywhere. The music school itself looked like something out of a dream. The hallways were lined with grand pianos, and the walls were filled with pictures of famous musicians. The teachers were excited to meet him. Some had seen his video a dozen times. They greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and asking questions. But the boy didn't say much. He smiled politely, nodded, and looked curiously around the room. When they asked him to play something, he sat down and began to perform one of his favorite songs. Not the difficult one from the competition, but a soft, gentle tune he had made up himself. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. The room grew quiet as he played. Even the teachers, who had heard countless talented students, felt something different. There was something pure about the way he played, something that couldn't be taught. After he finished, the head instructor smiled. "You play like you're speaking," he said softly. "Like the piano is your voice." The boy looked at the instrument and said, "It feels like that sometimes." Over the next few months, the boy began attending classes. The teachers showed him new techniques, different ways to move his hands, and how to read complex sheet music. He learned quickly, but he never lost his simple way of feeling the music. Other students admired him but also felt puzzled by him. Some spent hours practicing, trying to perfect their timing, but when he played, it seemed effortless. He never showed off or compared himself to anyone. If someone asked how he did it, he'd just smile and say, "I listen." The teachers soon realized that his gift wasn't just about skill. It was about understanding. He could listen to a song once and play it back, not just with accuracy but with emotion, the same emotion the composer must have felt when creating it. Sometimes, after class, he would sit by himself in the empty hall, just playing quietly. The janitor, who often cleaned the floors at night, would stop and listen for a few minutes. "You make it sound easy," he once said. The boy smiled. "It feels easy when it's the right song." But as the months went by, things started to change around him. More people wanted to meet him. More cameras appeared. Every performance he gave was recorded and shared online. Some people started calling him the prodigy. Others called him the miracle pianist. He didn't like the attention much. He didn't like when people treated him like something rare or untouchable. He still wanted to be just a boy who played music because it made him happy. His parents noticed how busy his schedule was becoming. He had less time to rest, less time to play for fun. Every time he sat at the piano, there was someone watching, expecting magic. It wasn't the same anymore. One evening, after a long day of lessons and interviews, his mother found him sitting quietly in his room, staring at his hands. "Are you tired?" she asked softly. He nodded. "A little. Everyone wants me to play something special, but I just want to play what I feel." She sat beside him and put her arm around his shoulders. "Then do that," she said. "Play what you feel. You don't owe anyone anything." He looked at her, unsure. "But what if they stop liking me?" She smiled. "Then they were never listening for the right reason." That night, he went back to the piano and started to play. Not for the cameras, not for the teachers, not even for the audience waiting online, but for himself. The melody that came out was soft, peaceful, and full of warmth. It wasn't complicated or flashy. It was honest. His father came to the doorway and listened quietly. The sound filled the house again, just like it used to. In that moment, they realized something important. No matter how far his talent took him, what truly made him special wasn't how perfectly he played, but how deeply he felt every note. The next day, when his teacher asked him to perform something for a public event, the boy agreed, but he chose a song of his own. It was a simple tune that he had created late one night, a song about peace, about home, about love. When he played it on stage, there were no fast runs or complex rhythms, just emotion, real human emotion. And when it ended, the silence in the room was heavy, not from surprise, but from connection. People didn't just hear the music, they felt it. The applause came slowly this time, gentle and heartfelt. Some wiped tears from their eyes. The judges, the teachers, the audience, they all saw it again, that same light from the competition. The reminder that music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. After the performance, the boy walked off stage and found his parents waiting for him. His father hugged him tightly. "That," he said, "was the best one yet." The boy smiled softly. "Because it was mine." And from that day on, no matter where he played, big concerts, small rooms, or empty halls, he never tried to impress anyone. He just told stories through sound, one note at a time. People still called him a genius, but those who listened closely knew better. He wasn't a genius trying to prove something. He was just a boy who loved music, and somehow that love had become a language everyone in the world could understand. Years passed, and the boy grew older, though not much had changed in the way he saw music. To him, it was still the same, a voice that spoke when words couldn't. He still played every day, not because someone told him to, but because the piano had become his friend. The world, however, continued to see him as something more than just a boy. He had become a name people whispered with admiration. "That's the boy who made the judges cry," they'd say. "That's the one who played what no one else could." But fame, as it often does, began to change the space around him. There were more expectations, more requests, and more pressure to do things bigger and better. Managers wanted him to perform in grand halls, sponsors wanted him in advertisements, and organizers wanted him to play the same piece that made him famous again and again. He did, sometimes, but each time he played it, something felt a little different, a little emptier. One day, while preparing for another large concert, he sat alone backstage, staring at the keys of a small practice piano. His fingers hovered over them, but he didn't play. He just sat quietly, listening to the faint sounds of people outside taking their seats. His mother walked in softly. "They're ready for you," she said. He nodded slowly. "Do I have to play that same piece again?" She paused, sensing the weight in his voice. "Only if you want to," she said gently. "Play what feels right." He looked up at her. "I don't even know what feels right anymore." She smiled sadly and sat beside him. "When you were little," she said, "you didn't play to impress anyone. You played because it made you happy. That's still inside you. Maybe you just need to listen again." He stared at the piano and pressed a few quiet notes. The sound echoed in the empty room. Then, slowly, he began to play something new, something no one had ever heard before. The melody was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it grew stronger, fuller. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. When he walked onto the stage that night, he didn't play the piece that had made him famous. He didn't play anything people expected. He played that new melody, raw, emotional, real. At first, the audience didn't recognize it. Some looked confused, others leaned forward, trying to understand. But as the music unfolded, the room fell into silence. Every note seemed to tell a story, of a little boy who once played from his heart, of dreams that grew too heavy, and of someone finding his way back to the sound that started it all. By the time he finished, the hall was completely still. No one moved. And then, as if waking from a dream, they began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder and louder until the room filled with applause. But the boy didn't bow right away. He just sat there, looking at the piano, smiling softly. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. After the concert, people came up to him with tears in their eyes. One man said, "I don't know what that song was, but it felt like it was talking to me." Another whispered, "That was the most human thing I've ever heard." He didn't say much in response. He simply thanked them and walked quietly out of the hall with his parents. That night, back at the hotel, he sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. His father joined him and asked, "How did it feel?" The boy smiled faintly. "Like I remembered something I forgot for a long time." His father nodded. "Then that's worth more than any trophy." From then on, his life began to take a quieter path. He still performed, but not everywhere and not all the time. He chose where he played, sometimes in grand halls, sometimes in small community centers, and sometimes in hospitals or schools where children needed hope. He believed music shouldn't only live on big stages. It should live where people needed it most. There was one day, a few years later, when he visited a children's hospital. The staff had invited him to play for the young patients. Some were too weak to leave their beds, but the nurses wheeled them into the hall to listen. He sat down at the piano and smiled at them. "What do you want to hear?" he asked. One small girl, her voice thin and quiet, said, "Something happy." So he began to play. Not the grand songs people expected from a famous pianist, but a light, joyful tune. Something simple, filled with laughter. The children clapped along softly, and for a moment, the room felt brighter. Afterward, the little girl looked up at him and said, "It sounded like sunshine." He laughed. "That's exactly what I was trying to make it sound like." Moments like that reminded him why he had started in the first place. Not for applause, not for fame, but for connection. for the invisible thread that music weaves between hearts. Years went by and the boy, now a young man, continued to play. He began to teach, too, taking on students who reminded him of himself when he was young. He never taught them to chase perfection. He taught them to listen. Don't think about playing every note right, he would say. Think about what the music is trying to say. The piano can only speak if you let it. His students loved him because he made learning feel human. He never raised his voice or scolded mistakes. Instead, he encouraged them to explore, to feel, to express. One day, a reporter visited his studio for an interview. She asked, "Do you still think about that night when the judges surrendered?" He smiled softly. "Sometimes. It was special. But it was just the beginning, not the whole story." "What do you think the real story is?" she asked. He thought for a moment, then said, "That music isn't about proving how good you are. It's about reminding people that they're not alone. Every time someone listens and feels something, joy, sadness, hope, that's the real miracle." The reporter smiled, clearly moved. "So you don't see yourself as a genius?" He laughed quietly. "No, just someone who listens closely." His words spread far and wide, and people admired him even more. Not for his talent alone, but for his humility. He had become something rare in the world of fame. A person who never forgot the heart behind the sound. One evening, years later, he returned to the same hall where it had all begun. The place where, as a small boy, he had played the unsolvable piece and stunned the world. The same piano stood there, polished and shining under the lights. He sat down, placed his hands gently on the keys, and closed his eyes. He didn't play the old piece. He didn't play the song from the big concert. He played something new again, something simple and full of warmth. The kind of melody that made you remember quiet mornings, gentle laughter, and the feeling of being safe. As he played, a soft smile crossed his face. In every note you could hear the journey, the curiosity of the child, the pressure of fame, the rediscovery of joy, and the peace that comes when you finally understand your purpose. When the last note faded, he sat in silence. There was no audience this time, no cameras, just him and the sound that lingered in the air. He looked up at the empty seats and whispered softly, "Thank you." And in that quiet hall, it felt like the music itself was answering him. A faint echo of everything he had ever played, reminding him that once, a long time ago, even the judges had surrendered not to a perfect performance, but to the honesty of a little boy who simply loved to play.